Friends, I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. As Corey said, I'm a UCC minister, and I've spent a lot of my time not within the walls of a congregation, but actually in the streets with people working for human rights. Most of the weight of my, 27 plus years in ordained ministry has been walking alongside people whose own human rights have been violated in severe ways, from poor people organizing with the Kensington Welfare Rights Movement for the right to housing, to farm workers in the southwest town of Immokalee, Florida, who over the last 20 years have confronted some of the worst human rights abuses in our nation, including forced labor, poverty wages, wage theft, sexual assault, and harassment. For anyone who knows anything about U.S. agriculture, you know these problems. They're endemic. They come with a long history of slavery behind them, and slavery in a new form, in new ways, these days is still sadly alive and well in that industry. However, I've got fabulous news, and that is within the Fair Food Program, which is a program that was designed by farm workers and in which the majority of fresh tomato growers in Florida and up and down the East Coast currently participate, along with 14 of the world's largest food buyers. They have been collaborating together and have dramatically improved rights, eliminating forced labor, eliminating sexual harassment and assault, dealing with wage theft in such a way that we're at the point of prevention. There are often grandiose claims made about rights gains, but I tell you today that within the Fair Food Program, which is operating in 7 states and affecting the lives and livelihoods of over several thousand, around 30,000 farm workers right now, that these rights have truly been realized. And they've been realized because the workers themselves have been at the heart of the design process, the implementation process, the ongoing monitoring process to identify and defend their own rights. Religious organizations and people of faith have been critical allies with the farm workers in achieving these human rights gains. And so today I'm going to talk with you a little bit about what people of faith and also students have done in this movement, and in particular the unique role that the church has played. You heard Corey mention that I worked with the Presbyterian Church USA for 12 years as a national staff person. I'm going to look at the role that the church played in moving these rights forward and what we learned about ourselves and our own power in the process. I'm absolutely delighted you're here. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes up front, show you a few clips of videos, and then we'll get into lots and Q&A, and all questions are welcome. I love it. So let me start by saying for generations there have been these endemic human rights abuses in U.S. agriculture, right? But the way we conquered them was that farm workers themselves gathered and pooled their own experience from Latin America and the Caribbean and said, how have we been defending our rights in our home countries? How can we come together in Immokalee, Florida to defend our rights here? Then they reached out to consumers and said, we've been going through a lot of actions here in Florida that are directed at growers to try to change these conditions. They started with, a all-out march after one worker who was in his teens had been beaten within an inch of his life for asking for a drink of water in the field. They did an all-out march to the crew leader's house. They put that crew leader who oversaw workers in the field out of business, but they knew that was just the start. They were able to constrain violence like pistol whipping and people getting slashed with machetes in the area of Immokalee. But in order to expand these protections and get the real increase in wages and other protections that they needed, they knew that they had to go further. They did long-standing strikes, work stoppages with thousands of workers that prevented the growers from having workers in their fields. These are day laborers, though. They're hired for the day, making sub-poverty wages. So do you think they could hold out for a long time doing a labor strike? No, exactly right. Their own financial insecurity made it impossible to continue that for long term. What they were able to do were 2 huge work stoppages for 1 week at a time. And that certainly put the growers on notice that this group of workers had organized itself and was looking for change. It was not sufficient, though, yet to change the conditions. They did a 240-mile march across Florida and ended up at the Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association. And there were some students that joined them on the march, and there were some people of faith and some church people who came out and joined them on that march. But you know what? When they got to the Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association, the door was closed because, as you may know, farm workers are excluded from many of the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the overtime provisions of that act, and from the National Labor Relations Act, which gives workers in other industries the rights to organize and to bargain collectively. So those growers and the grower associations were under absolutely no obligation to negotiate with farm workers, to really deal with them. In fact, during one of those work strikes, one of the growers said to another grower, this was overheard, "You know, the tractor doesn't tell the farmer how to run his farm." So how was it possible to move from a situation where growers were considering farm workers as no better than tractors, as tools, as objects? How did we get from there to a fair food program with some of the world's largest corporations and the vast majority of those growers sitting as equals at a table and following this fair food program that was farm worker designed? Not designed by Noelle Damico, who works at the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, not a corporate social responsibility program from McDonald's or from Walmart or from any one of those other corporations, not the latest and greatest idea from growers themselves, but a program designed by farm workers. How did we get to this? That's the story I'm going to tell you today. So I want to take a quick look at this fair food program, because so often, I don't know about you, we hear about working for structural change, right? People say, oh, well, that's an issue, but we really need to get to the root cause. Has anybody ever heard that? Yes, some people have heard that. And we think, well, that would really be great, so we're just going to work incrementally. We'll work on this a little bit, and the generations that come after us might see it. What I want to tell you is it is possible. There's one message that I want you to go away from this lunch with. It's the idea that it is actually possible to change the structures of our society so that they deliver the rights and protections that they need to the most vulnerable among us. It is possible, and I tell you it's possible because we've done it. And so I'm going to share this video with you to give you a sense of what's been accomplished. And I want you to remember throughout, these are documented gains, and I invite you to go out and learn more about them as well. So let me pull up this video real quick, and it'll show you where we are now, and then I'm going to tell you how we got there.
For generations, farm work has been one of the lowest paid and least protected jobs in the country.
Los sueldos han caído en términos reales desde 1980, que provocó al Departamento de Labor de los Estados Unidos llamar a los trabajadores agrícolas una mano de obra en gran peligro económico.
90% of this country's winter tomatoes are grown right here in Florida each year. Farm workers have historically faced regular abuse in the fields, including wage theft, sexual violence, and in the most extreme cases, forced labor. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers, a human rights organization, is rewriting this history through its Fair Food program, a groundbreaking model of social responsibility based on a unique partnership among farm workers, growers, and major retail brands. Its goal is to raise wages and affirm the dignity of workers in the fields.
Hoy el programa por comida justa ha empezado a transformar la industria y a proteger los derechos humanos fundamentales de los trabajadores.
Here's how it works. Buyers like Subway, McDonald's, and Walmart each pay growers a penny per pound premium on tomatoes, which growers pass on to their workers in the form of a bonus. More than $14 million in just 3 years. To participate, growers must adhere to the Fair Food Code of Conduct, which outlines workers' new rights under the program. Fair Food Farms ensure zero tolerance for forced labor. Prohibitions against verbal and physical abuse, including sexual harassment. Safe working conditions, such as shade, clean restrooms, and drinking water. The right to report abuses without fear of retaliation. And a fair wage. The Fair Food Standards Council is a third-party monitor created to investigate complaints and ensure compliance through regular audits on the farms. The Fair Food Standards Council also staffs a 24-hour hotline for farm workers and helps them navigate a complaint resolution process whenever there's a problem on the farm.
Bajo el programa Por Comida Justa, la Coalición de Trabajadores de Immokalee conduce sesiones de educación de trabajador a trabajador para informar a los trabajadores de sus nuevos derechos y sus responsabilidades.
To enforce these standards, participating buyers commit to buying Florida tomatoes only from growers in good standing with the program.
Pero todavía hay trabajo que hacer para expandir esos cambios pioneros, más allá que la industria de tomate de Florida.
Your role is critical. You can help expand the Fair Food Program and eliminate human rights abuses in the fields.
Juntos podemos asegurar que el nuevo día amanecerá no solamente en Florida, sino por más de cientos de miles de trabajadores agrícolas en todo el país.
Find out how you can make a difference. Go to fairfoodprogram.org.
So this gives you a sense of what's been accomplished. Let me amplify the figures because that video was made 3 years ago. It's now over $26 million. The program is in 7 states and now in 3 crops: tomatoes, strawberry, and bell peppers. How did this come about, though? This is not a program that just dropped from the sky. As I said, it's a program that was designed by farm workers. The faith community, as I mentioned earlier, became involved with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a farm worker organization created by farm workers and run by farm workers in the mid-90s when they were doing those work stoppages, when they were doing the 240-mile march. But Immokalee, though it's a town that we may not know about up here in New York, was very well known in the Southwest Florida area because it's where all those poor farm workers were, right? So all churches from Naples on Thanksgiving morning would come out and they'd bring turkeys for Thanksgiving, and various helping organizations would give used clothing to Immokalee to help the farm workers. And all of this was very beautiful. It's a way of saying to one's neighbor, I know you're there, I care about you, I believe you should have clothing and food enough, and I know you're not getting those things, right? But the farm workers said to those religious leaders, especially, who had been coming to them for years, who had prayed with them during a 30-day hunger strike, who had walked with them on that march and said, while we appreciate your donations of food and clothing, why is it that we as farm workers have to work 6, sometimes 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours in the field, and we cannot afford to buy those resources for our own families? We can't feed or clothe our own families. We don't want your pity. We want your partnership. We don't want your pity. We want your partnership. In the book of Isaiah, there is a beautiful passage in chapter 58. It's the third part of Isaiah that was written after the Jewish leadership had been taken to exile in Babylon, and now they had returned, and they had a decision to make. What kind of society would they build? Would they build it on the backs of the poor, or would they build it a different way? Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and God will answer. Then you shall cry for help, and God will say, here I am. Think about that poetic passage from Isaiah. Loose the bonds of injustice, undo every yoke. There's the idea, a structural vision of a society where injustice does not exist. Certainly contrary to fact, right? Poetry inspires our imagination, our values. But there in that passage is that idea, it is possible to create that kind of society. But it's predicated on understanding our relationship one to another. Do not hide yourself from your own kin. Your own kin. Let's remember that the leadership that was taken off into exile were the more well-to-do of the Jewish leaders of that time. The poorest of the poor who were tilling the land, the subsistence farmers, well, the Babylonians were a smart empire. They let them keep tilling the ground so that the produce could keep coming forth and they could get the benefits of that. But the leadership is who went off into exile. So when we think about this passage, this is a passage especially to those parts of the church that aren't necessarily poor themselves, but need to see that they are in relationship fundamentally with people who have been made poor, that indeed we're kin, we're part of the same family. More than 200 years ago, William Blake wrote another poem called The Human Abstract, and in it he said, "Pity would be no more if we did not make another poor, and charity no more could be if all were as fortunate as we." Written in another context, again, Blake directing himself especially to the higher echelons of English society of that day, and in particular to the church. When the farm workers came to religious leaders and said, "We don't want your pity, we want your partnership," they were just calling for a consumer boycott of Taco Bell. And local religious leaders, knowing the farm workers were serious, trusting them, and believing that God was calling them to walk with them, said, "Okay, we'll support this." So in April of 2001, there were like 23 of us outside a Taco Bell on Route 41 with some signs that said, "Boycott Taco Bell." Were there thousands and thousands of consumers involved? No! But those local religious leaders began to create momentum by going to their presbyteries, to their other regional church bodies, and even to national assemblies, calling on the church to support this boycott, which had been called by the farm workers themselves, right? Interesting, when it came to the Presbyterian Church's General Assembly, which is its national democratic decision-making body, one of the questions that was asked on the plenary floor was, who called this boycott? Was it a lot of well-meaning church people? Because what if Taco Bell stops buying from there and all the jobs go away? How are you going to feel then? And that's when it becomes important to say the people whose rights are being violated are the ones who determine this course of action. We're following their lead and we're walking beside them in that. The church didn't think up a boycott, the farm workers did, and that meant they were ready to take on whatever was necessary to push this forward. You see, from their vantage point in Immokalee, they saw this incredible supply chain. And down at the bottom were workers who were exploited or in some instances enslaved, the growers who employed them, the corporations that purchased from them, and then at the very top of that pyramid, consumers like you and I. They called on these corporations to pay a penny more per pound of tomatoes down the supply chain to increase farm worker wages and to use their power of purchasing to ensure that the rights that they had designed would indeed be implemented in the fields. And if it were the case that sexual assault took place in the fields, that the corporations there would suspend purchasing until not only that individual case was cleared up, but the root causes and other things that made it possible for that to happen had been eradicated. And that's what we began work on together. Because people of faith locally took these overtures and these petitions to the national assemblies of a variety of churches, those churches began to walk side by side with farm workers. And as that happened, church people needed to say, you know, what is my position in the supply chain? I've never boycotted before. There was a whole generation that didn't know that boycott had been in the repertoire of the Presbyterian Church in the past. The Presbyterian Church had supported boycotts for many, many years against child labor in the 20s. They had supported boycotts with the UFW grape and lettuce boycotts. They had supported the Nestle infant formula boycott. They had supported the J.P. Stevens shirtwaist factory boycott. But guess what? That last boycott in 1979 was the last one that the Presbyterian Church had supported. And now it was 2002. A whole generation had grown up not being in the streets, not boycotting corporations, not understanding that the church had or could take on that role. So there was a lot to do. And I was running around the country talking with lots of churches, involving people, and putting them into relationship with the farm workers. What are some of the things that we did concretely as the church? During the campaign, we hosted farm workers as they crisscrossed the country on truth tours, sleeping 75 workers in church basements, feeding them, getting out into the street, marching together with them. Those were things that individual congregations and people of faith did. Lots of postcards. We used our position as an institution of great authority in our society. You know, religious institutions have that authority still granted to us in our society, to use that as a platform for talking about the importance of these rights for farm workers and to using our power to open doors and create access for farm workers so that they could speak in their own voice about what they needed. We didn't speak for farm workers. We spoke with farm workers. Then as the relationship continued to deepen, the farm workers in particular asked the Presbyterian Church USA if we would do something important, and that was try to open some conversations with Taco Bell's parent company, Yum Brands. This is way back in 2003. And so I made some overtures to Yum Brands, and we were indeed able to open those conversations. And eventually the coalition said, we'd like to start negotiations. We think they're ready, and this is after a lot of pressure had been put on the company. I said, okay. And they said, would you convene these negotiations and would you serve as a guarantor? And so we held talks at the Carter Center. And I point this out to you because a lot of times we hear, well, the church should really stay neutral in situations like this. You know, you don't want to go wading in because that might preclude our ability to bring people to the table to help all sides hear one another. But actually what it was really important to do was for the church to take sides on behalf of those who had been pressed down in order to help those who had been pressed down sit as equals at the table with those with more power. It was precisely not our neutrality, but the fact that we took a side that made the company, in this case Yum Brands, eager to have us at the table. They also wanted to convince us. So I would say one lesson for the church coming out of this is we're not called to create neutral spaces, but truthful spaces where people can encounter and dialogue, and where we are always standing with those who are pressed down or excluded. One other lesson that we had is that we began to see that our future as individuals and as an institution was entwined with that of farm workers. We didn't see them as them over there that we were doing this good thing for, but rather by looking at that supply chain and understanding our positionality in it, that we could see ourselves as intricately connected to the choices that with our choices that we were making to human well-being or exploitation. And over the years, in 2005, Yum Brands came to the table and signed the very first Fair Food Agreement. And they should be given a lot of credit, frankly, because at that juncture, the Fair Food Program was a dream. It was an idea. It was not created yet, in fact. Now, as we move forward from 2005, there are now a total of 14 corporations involved. The Fair Food Program was implemented, began its implementation in 2011, and now continues to expand. Its model of worker-driven social responsibility has been also translated into the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Safety. And some of you may have heard that Migrant Justice, a group of dairy workers in Vermont, just won a Fair Food Agreement with Ben and Jerry's. And they're going to be implementing what they're calling the Milk with Dignity program there. Again, church leaders and also leaders from other faith, I'm going to call out Truah here, the Rabbinic Voice for Human Rights, have been very pivotal in bringing about these changes, working hand in hand with farm workers. Now, we still got a lot of work to do. I've got some postcards here because one fast food company has most certainly not joined the Fair Food Program. In fact, instead of joining the Fair Food Program, Wendy's pulled its purchasing from Florida and sent it to Mexico. And if any of you know anything about Mexico, you know that it is one of the most violent countries. Right now, it's having its most violent year ever. When workers complain in Mexico, they are disappeared, like the 80 workers who complained on the job in Oaxaca this past spring. Disappeared, meaning wiped off. Nobody knows where they are, surely killed. So Mexico is its own very complex situation. We also have our eye on Mexico. But when we move there and how we change it is something that requires all the right people at the table. Wendy's, by going there with its purchasing, is merely profiting off the vulnerability of these workers there. So what we want Wendy's to do instead is join the Fair Food Program that is established and begin to think with us how we can change those conditions elsewhere. I'm going to pass these around and you can feel free to take them, and let's open it on up to some questions. So what are you thinking? What do you want to know? What are you concerned about? What doesn't sound right to you? Oh, I don't believe it. Come on. What are you thinking? Anybody skeptical? That's cool too. Yeah.
So you said that you have you've expanded from tomatoes into strawberries and bell peppers.
Yes.
I'm just wondering what other areas, I guess, or where are you looking to move next with the Fair Food Program?
That's a great question. We're actually looking in a number of different industries, but what's key here is that we want to have the pieces in place to move there. So what we've been looking at right now is continuing to expand in the 3 crops where we are. And one of the reasons I'm answering sort of cautiously is because the key to this program's ability to deliver the kind of rights gains it has is because it's knitted very specifically into the industry. So for example, the piece rate in tomatoes is a 32-pound bucket that you saw in the movie there. And that bucket, farm workers used to get 40 to 50 cents a pound. They now get an additional 32 cents per pound, so at least 32 cents per pound. So it brings them above 77 cents, and so they're earning. Now, if we went into grapefruits, carrots, it's a 25-pound sack. When we're going into other industries, the quantity is different, and also, frankly, the way that employers extract unpaid wages can differ. The way they extracted them in tomatoes was by requiring workers to overfill buckets. That's one of the ways. Another was not counting as compensable time that truly was, the wait times before workers went into the fields to pick, and we corrected that by having time clocks in the field, a good old-fashioned solution that gives workers control over their hours and their pay. So as we're moving very deliberately and slowly, but it's an exciting moment because we know the principles of worker-driven social responsibility can be expanded into different industries and sites. We're watching it happen. Other questions?
How long would it take an average worker to pick like the 32-pound bucket?
That's a really good question. What I can tell you is in a day, working at top speed, workers would have to pick 2 tons, really over 2 tons of tomatoes to make the minimum wage. So that gives you a sense of what their picking rate is like. It depends not only on the worker strength, it also depends on the tomato plant itself. The first harvest of the field, you're going to get a lot of tomatoes off that plant. The third harvest, not so many tomatoes, so you're going to make a lot less money. So it varies kind of wildly. Yes?
I was curious, where's the government's role?
Great question. Where is the government's role, right? You're kind of saying, like, wait a minute, this is the United States of America. We've got some laws in the books against this stuff. Don't we have a Department of Labor that I've heard of somewhere? Yes, the government is there. What this program is a market-driven program that works alongside of the government. Are we doing the government's job? I don't know, maybe in some way, but we're also pushing government to do their job. U.S. Department of Labor has wage and hours inspectors that are in every state, and their responsibility is to oversee proper delivery of wages and hours in every industry, by the way, not just one industry. A lot of times you have 1 or 2 inspectors for, half the state of Florida. Are those people going to be able to do the kinds of inspections they need to? No, in no way. And when complaints are registered, it's after these abuses have already taken place. And oftentimes the complaint resolution process can take years and years. So what we did was build, frankly, a parallel system that put farm workers in the driver's seat and delivered immediate results. Same with the EEOC, right? So you have these egregious instances of sexual harassment and assault in the field that have happened over and over, and if you just Google it, you'll see what's been going on in the field for years and years and years. And every so often, women farm workers have been able to get together and maybe in a group and surmount the various barriers to both reporting to the EEOC and actually getting their case taken up. And then years later, you might get a judgment. And sometimes those judgments are pretty severe in the millions of dollars and hopefully lead to a deterrence mentality. But sometimes the decisions are really no more than the cost of doing business. But again, it's after the fact, after lives have been disrupted and people have been harmed. So with this program, we try to get in front of it. The good news, though, is in the program, of course, we work hand in hand with the Department of Labor, with the EEOC, with the U.S. Justice Department. And so where cases merit, we definitely cooperate back and forth. And so it's a collaborative relationship at this juncture, and hopefully is stimulating Department of Labor and others to think in new ways about how they can carry out their work. Other questions? Yes?
Could you say a little bit more about corporate responsibility?
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of mirroring your work, or do you have different goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say corporate responsibility, if we look at it over the last 25 or 30 years, was an initiative that was born by corporations and which has served corporations very well. But if we look at the results for workers in whatever industry you want to look at, whether it's the garment industry, the agricultural industry, or the manufacturing industry, what we see is workers haven't really made the kinds of gains that they should have. So while it may serve as a temporary brand protection approach for corporations, most corporate social responsibility initiatives, first of all, are not designed by workers. Well, actually, none of them are besides ours. Secondly, they might have aspirational goals. We expect our suppliers to pay and then fill in the blank on low bar standards, the minimum wage in the country where that applies. So it's usually the bottom of the barrel standard. And then thirdly, they have little to no mechanisms for actually finding out what's going on in their supply chain. And then finally, there are no consequences for those suppliers that turn a blind eye to abuses. And that was the situation. So we see our approach of worker-driven social responsibility as the antidote to corporate social responsibility, which has served in a way for brand protection. But these days, you know what? That brand protection can go up in smoke with a click of the mouse as consumers find out about the Rana Plaza building collapse, for example, several years ago, and the connections to corporations buying there. So it's an invitation, though, and an opportunity, though, for corporations to take a look at their supply chain in a different way and to think about how they, from their position as a corporation, can enhance this model, which puts workers, who are the experts on the ground and what needs to get done, in the driver's seat of creating these solutions. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about the difference between our work in our work on worker-driven social responsibility and its distinctiveness to what are called multi-stakeholder initiatives and also to corporate social responsibility, you can head on out to WSR, Worker-Driven Social Responsibility network.org, WSR-network.org. And there's several white papers. We just launched our network last week at the Ford Foundation. There's an article in today's Guardian newspaper about it as well. Other questions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about from the workers' perspective? So we know that workers living in poverty, can't meet their own needs. So with this particular program, we're seeing that their wages are now being increased. Can you talk about, have you been monitoring that in terms of quality of life for workers?
Absolutely.
And those that are living in Immokalee, how is that going for them?
Absolutely. And again, it's how much more they earn in a given week is going to depend on where we are in the season and how much they're picking for participating corporations. I also want to note, by the way, these benefits go to any worker working. You don't have to be a member of the coalition of Immokalee workers to get these benefits. Any worker working on a fair food farm gets the increased wages and the rights protections. So what we see is it can be, up to $120 a week in a worker's paycheck, which when you're earning at poverty level is a huge difference in terms of everything from groceries to, healthcare needs, etc. The real benefit to them on the job, though, is that a lot of the abuses that they were facing on a daily basis have been eliminated, and they're protected. When they make a call to that hotline that you heard about, it's answered by an investigator, and that hotline is open 24/7. People speak multiple languages, and not just English and Spanish and Haitian Creole, but Mam and Zapoteca and Quiche, the indigenous languages that are spoken by some of the workers. So when a call comes in, an investigation is immediately open, and typically those investigations are resolved within 2 weeks, even in bigger cases. What we've seen over the years with workers is that when we started out, the complaints were lower, but the nature of the complaints were very severe. So cases of severe sexual assault, cases of forced labor. Then as we've gone on, it's 6 years now in implementation, we're seeing an increase in the numbers of calls coming in, but a decrease in the severity. So it might be, my paycheck doesn't look quite right, I think I'm missing a few hours of wages, and then it's boom, boom, resolved. It's not, oh, I got beaten up in the field because I raised my hand to ask for a glass of water. So we're seeing just what we want. The workers are trusting the system, that we know that because the numbers are really, really high, but the abuses are truly being cleaned up. So that's the big part for the workers, to be able to come home. I mean, think about a quality of life issue here. Workers used to have to ride 20 to 200 miles to get to the fields where they would work, and they weren't allowed to go out and start picking until the crew leader said go. They would gather at 3:34 in the morning and take these bus rides on these dilapidated buses all the way out there, and then sit around waiting for the dew to dry. Why did that happen? Well, because the workers' time wasn't important. You know, the growers weren't paying them for that time. But guess what? That process has stopped. Workers are getting on the bus several hours later now and going to the fields because they have those time clocks that they punch in and out, tracking their hours. So all that wait time became compensable time. So the growers have an incentive to narrow it. What does it mean in a daily life of a farm worker? It means that a father gets to walk his son to school in the morning. It means that for child care, they're not getting up at 3 in the morning and wheeling their child down a dark Immokalee street to put him with a person who will keep him until the next person takes over at 7 o'clock in the morning. So these are really humane changes that have happened that are benefiting them not only economically but in their own families and social relationships.